Hey guys, so I come to you with a tag video. This is the favorite authors book tag. This was created by Steve Donahue, although it was kind of inaugurated by Alex of What Page Are You On? Alex did a video where he talked about his favorite authors, but rather than do a conventional sort of 1 through 10 list, like in the BookTube top 10s tag that Jason put together, he created 3 separate tiers of authors. So he named 6 authors who were not quite authors he loved, but couldn't quite crack the top. There were maybes, who were maybe favorites, so like just a little bit closer to being favorites, and then the cream of the crop, the ones who made the cut and were his absolute favorite authors. And then Steve Donahue did a video where he weaponized it into a tag, and then tagged everyone on the world, and I live in the world, so I consider myself tagged. Making this tag was a learning experience for me. It took me an hour or two to put this list together, and I put it together right after Steve posted his video, and I've been tweaking it ever since. But I think I have arrived at a place where I'm happy with it, and no, I have to just accept that this is just a snapshot of my favorite writers and what kind of a reader I am at this moment in time. This list could be different in a year, it could be different in 2 years, it could be even more different in 5 years, and exponentially different in 10 and 20 years. These are my favorite writers right now, and so we will start with the not quite authors. So the first of these is Harold Bloom, the great literary critic who is a professor at Yale. He's written dozens of books, and he is not a fan favorite on BookTube, but I love him because I would not be the reader that I am without him. I would not love poetry the way I do without him, and I would not love reading classics the way I do without him. So he had to be here. Next is J.R.R. Tolkien. My favorite book is The Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien, and he meticulously built this fantastical world and made it seem so real, even though the stuff happening in it is so crazy, in a way that no one else has achieved, I think, just because he poured so much of his life and so much of his heart and soul into that world. And the stories that he wrote within that world just taught me so much about sorrow and pity and grief and the how terrible but how beautiful the human condition can be. So of course Tolkien had to be here. It's a little surprising that he's not in the favorites category, but that was part of the learning experience. Next is T.S. Eliot, the great American modernist poet. His poetry is some of the most compelling explorations of what it is to be a human being in the modern world. And it's also just incredibly lyrical and beautiful. I think sometimes that's lost when people talk about T.S. Eliot. They forget that it's also just lovely poetry, especially when you read a love poem like La Figlia che piange. But, The Wasteland, which I reread every year, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, The Hollow Men, all his best poems I just adore for their lyricism. And the reason he's in the not quite category is because he is incredibly elusive, he is incredibly difficult, and perhaps a bit overly intellectualized, so there are poems by him that I could live without. But he is a favorite. Next is Cormac McCarthy, who is also not a fan favorite on BookTube, and I fully acknowledge that he's far from a perfect writer. His prose can be pretentious and bloated, his dialogue can be stilted, his plot devices can be a bit contrived, but I like the stories he's telling. He's very philosophical, and he's ambitious, and the issues he's dealing with, I think, are incredibly important. Whether it's in Blood Meridian with the, violent streak that human beings have in them, or The Road, where the need for hope in our lives is portrayed so beautifully. Next is Karen Armstrong, an English writer on comparative religion and religious history. I would not have what I like to think of as a nuanced view of religion without her. She writes with so much sympathy and complexity on the subject of religion that is just so important in this world where our discourse on religion has become so black and white between the religious fundamentalists and the new atheists. So I love her writing, and I love her ideas. She is in the not quite category, mostly because her writing does get a bit repetitive. I do feel like some of her books are kind of just her rehashing the same content in a different light. So that's why she's in the not quite category. And the last author in the not quite category is Frank Herbert, the author of the Dune saga. He expresses so many important philosophical ideas, whether he's talking about environmentalism or economics or religion or messianism or the human condition. His ideas have become only more important as time has gone on, and his ideas are put forth in this story that is incredibly human and incredibly gripping and incredibly moving, that's so incredibly hard to do, so Frank Herbert had to be here. Right, moving on to the maybes. First off is Euripides, a Greek playwright who is one of the greatest psychologists that we've ever had. In his plays, there are no easy answers. There's generally two people who are going head-to-head in a Euripides play. There are other side characters, but generally it's two people going head-to-head in some kind of powerful argument, and there's never one side that's unambiguously correct. And both sides are portrayed with such psychological insight and sharpness that you can't help but believe that these are real people, even though their dialogue is being written in such a sort of high style. And Euripides is just brilliant. He might be my favorite playwright, even above Shakespeare, even though I obviously love Shakespeare. Next entry is Homer. I know Homer sort of isn't a real person, but he is who the Iliad and the Odyssey are attributed to, so he had to be on the list. He portrays so many visceral and important human struggles and emotions, grief, loss, love, both romantic love and love of, children and brothers and sons and daughters. Even though there are these mythic characters, any one of us could relate to what the characters go through in Homer. Next is Susan Sontag, whose prose and her thinking are so machine-like in the best way. And what I mean by that is that there's nothing that's out of place, I feel like, when I read an essay or a book by Susan Sontag. She just there's something immaculate about her mind that I so admire. Of all the writers on this list, she's probably the one where I could unironically say that I want to be her, just from her prose style to her thinking style to the books she reads, how much she has in her head. If I could have a quarter of it in my head, I would be content. The last of the maybes is William Shakespeare. And what can I say about the Bard other than that he puts forth this ideal of sort of optimistic nihilism throughout his plays. In Hamlet, we get the darker side of it, where we see someone struggling with this meaningless world, but then we have Cleopatra, who sort of embraces the meaningless world and sort of, takes a hedonistic route to enjoying her life, or Falstaff, who also takes this hedonistic route of, just enjoying the world's pleasures while being sort of amused by all the stupidity of the serious stuff that goes on in life. That's what I love about Shakespeare, is just that optimistic nihilism we see, and of course some of the most glorious verse that has ever been written in both his plays and the sonnets. Right, we are moving into the big guns now. We are into the favorites. So in ascending order, these are in order from 5 through number 1. So the number 5 is Mary Karr. She is a great American memoirist and essayist and poet. I have read her 3 volumes of memoir and 1 volume of her poetry, and I revere her primarily for her memoirs. They are such an honest and eloquent portrayal of growing up in a dysfunctional family and then growing up to be a dysfunctional human, but then sort of rising above that and getting through that and becoming a writer. And these memoirs are very much also about becoming a writer, and also the love of reading and the love of classics. And like with Harold Bloom, I think Mary Karr had a big hand in turning me into the kind of reader that I am, in appreciating classics and poetry. So yeah, she absolutely had to be here. Next is Virginia Woolf. I have not read a Virginia Woolf book that I have not loved. You know, there are the novels I have read by her, Orlando, one of the most beautifully written novels ever. Mrs. Dalloway, one of the most psychologically impressive novels I've ever read. To the Lighthouse, just incredibly eloquent. And The Waves, which is one of the only novels where I can say unambiguously that it actually blew my mind. And then A Room of One's Own, like with Susan Sontag, there's just something machine-like in her thinking. Again, in the best way possible, but written in a much different style. You know, she has this style of writing sentences where they almost seem kind of meandering and maybe aimless for a while because they're so long and complex, but then you get to the end and you realize that the sentence had to be written that way. So she's brilliant. Number 3 is Marilynne Robinson, the great American writer. You know, she writes with such human warmth about characters who aren't broken in the way that someone in like Mary Karr is, but are still so real and so, you know, like anyone we could meet at any day. And there is something so immaculate, I'm using that word a lot, about her prose. Her prose is like a finely chiseled neoclassical sculpture. And then her nonfiction, I mean, you know, her nonfiction is just a testament to doing your own thinking and never taking your ideas secondhand, and, you know, reading the primary sources and citing where you're getting your ideas, and not letting anyone tell you what to think about something. And that both sides of her writing career are just important in those different ways. And, alright, top 2. So, number 2 is Wallace Stevens, my favorite poet. Whether he's writing on the meaning of art, the meaning of life, the meaning of death, the non-meaning of the world, whatever he's writing about, I can turn to a page in the collected poems of Wallace Stevens and find a poem that will please me, even if it's not one of his best poems. And, you know, Wallace Stevens I will be reading on my deathbed. Number 1, my favorite author, I was a little surprised by this, actually. It's Samuel Beckett, the great Irish playwright, novelist, poet. His plays are these brilliant, like, parables that are absurd in their way. You know, you look at these, what's going on in them, and you see a woman buried to her waist in dirt with her husband lying beside her, and she's just sitting there going through her handbag, sort of trying to convince herself that she's happy because she has this handbag full of objects. Or you see 2 guys bumming around waiting for a guy named Godot to show up, and Godot never showing up. Or you see 2 guys in a room where one of these men can't stand and is stuck in a chair, and another man who is standing up and can't sit down and is forced to take care of this other guy. And in all these plays, you're wondering, what on earth is this? What's going on here? What relevance does this have to me? And what Beckett does is he invites you to think about how those situations might not be so different from human life in general. And that's why he is number 1. Even though I would also say that his fiction is far more of a mixed bag. His novel, How It Is, should have been on my top 10 in the BookTube Top 10s tag, because it is, it's very much more similar to his drama in many ways than to his other novels. But anyway, setting aside his novels, he is my favorite writer. Our 3 people I want to tag, Patrice Jones, Lillian Niesvender, and Joe Smith. No pressure at all, but if you want, let me know who your favorite authors are in the comments. And anyway, I hope you all enjoyed, and give me your thoughts in the comments. And I will talk to you all in my next video. Bye, guys.